All right, Pastor Matt here, and we are starting chapter 6 of On the Mortification of Sin by John Owen. In chapter 5, we looked at mortification, described negatively, in other words, what it is not. And chapter 6, he's going to dig into what it is. Chapter 6 is broken into 3 parts easily, so I'm going to use the division that John Owen has provided. It says mortifying a sin positively, and mortifying a lust has 3 components. And so I'd like to point out, let me grab my pen here. For those that are watching, you can watch this if you didn't know. Mortifying a lust has 3 components. And so mortifying a sin, mortifying a lust, he's using this interchangeably, sin and lust. And so he's kind of honing down on what it is. His 3 points, mortifying a lust has 3 components. He gives us habitually weakening it is number 1. That's what we're going to do this time. Part 2, constantly fighting and contending against it is part 2. And part 3, realizing success over it. So having not read through these yet, I will be reading through this and experiencing it with you as we're doing this. And we'll think about what this means and try to evaluate it while we're going along. So let's start with, and I will tell you though, I have looked, and this first one is the longest one. And so I'm going to keep to these 3 distinctions. This is going to be more one of the longer recordings. So I'll try to keep my commentary to myself for the most part, and then just read this first one. So mortifying a sin, positively stated. Number 1, habitually weakening it. Every lust is a depraved habit or attitude that continually inclines the heart toward evil. From that, we have a description of someone who has not truly mortified his lust. Quote, every purpose of the thoughts of his heart is filled with evil from morning to night. He is always under the power of a strong inclination to sin. The only reason a natural man does not pursue a particular lust day and night is because he has so many to serve. Each one cries out to be satisfied. Although he pursues his lusts in great variety, in reality he only wants to satisfy self. Let us suppose, then, that the lust or compulsion is a strong, deeply rooted, habitual inclination of both will and affections. I know that this is important in Protestant theology, this concept of affections. Let us suppose that the lust is lust or compulsion is a strong, deeply rooted, habitual inclination of both will and affections toward some actual sin. The sin itself is irrelevant. No matter what it is, it always stirs up fantasies, thoughts, and schemes about its object. This is why men are said to have their hearts set on evil. The bent of their spirits leans towards it to make provision for the flesh. A sinful, depraved habit differs from all natural or moral habits. Those incline the soul those incline the soul gently and appropriately to itself, while sinful habits impel with violence and fierceness. That is why lusts are said to fight or wage war against the soul. They rebel or rise up with the type of brutality and conflict that would be expected in a war. Romans 7:23 says we are led captive or made captive after sin's success in battle. All of these are works of great violence and fierceness. I could make it blatantly obvious from the description we have in Romans 7 that it darkens the mind, extinguishes our convictions, overthrows reason, blocks the power and influence of whatever hampers it, and consumes them all in flames. But this is not my present focus. The first thing we need to do in mortification is to weaken this habit of sin or lust. That way, it cannot rise up in us to conceive, agitate, provoke, entice, and disturb us with the same intensity, seriousness, and frequency it normally does. I'd like to give one caution or rule, by the way, and it is this. Though every lust by its nature equally and universally draws or drives us to sin, there are two limitations. So now he's going to give the two limitations. Number one, a particular lust may be unexpectedly amplified, heightened, and strengthened in someone. It has life, power, and vigor far beyond what another lust might have in him, or the same lust might have in someone else. When a lust aligns with a man's personality, the season or path of his life, the right circumstances, or when Satan has a handle on it, then that lust grows severe and fierce above all others, or above the same lust in another man. That is when its intense steam darkens the mind. Even though a man knows the same boundaries, they have no power or influence on his will. Instead, the consuming lust liberates all kinds of perverted affections and passions in him. Lust gets its strength especially by temptation. When a suitable temptation meets up with a matching lust, it gives it new life, vigor, power, violence, and rage that it did not seem to have before, nor seem to be capable of. Numerous examples of this might be listed, but that is for another treatise. So that is the first, as he put it. What do you say? I'll give a caution rule, by the way. In this, though, every lust by its limitations. That's the word I was looking for. Limitations, right here. So that was the first limitation. Second limitation: some lusts are far more obvious in their severity than others. Paul notes a difference between sexual impurity and all other sins. Ain't that the truth? Flee sexual immorality. Every other sin a man does is outside the body, but sexual immorality sins against his own body. For this reason, the behavior of sexual sin tends to be more tangible, more discernible than others. Perhaps someone is consumed by love of the world, and his lust in this area is no less dominant than sexual lust would be, but it does not ignite the same consuming, forceful frenzy that sexual lust does. Consider further that such men may think they are mortified, and they may appear so in the eyes of the world. Yet they have the same dominating lust as those who cry out in astonishment when their untamed and disturbing behavior appears. Indeed, their craving is no less than those who have been driven by its power into scandalous sins. It is only that their lusts are for things that do not produce such disruption in their soul. They can be exercised more with a calmer demeanor, or their natural temperament does not generate the same intensity as someone else's might. Hmm. I repeat, he's done with his two limitations. I repeat, the primary thing in mortification is to weaken this habit so that it does not drive and agitate us as much or entice and distract us as often. We do not want it to be able to disrupt around us as we take away its life, vigor, promptness, and ambition. This is called crucifying the flesh with its passions. That is, we take away its blood and vitality, which give it strength and power. We waste away the body of death day by day. Now, I'm going to pause for just a moment. I said I was going to try not to interrupt as much as possible. This is very important. And this kind of goes along with things that he said previously about the reality that mortifying sin, and I think that this adds a sense of realism, realistically. It's a realistic view of mortifying sin is the seeking of weakening it. This is not meant to excuse sin when it happens, and I'm guessing he'll probably talk about things like that as he has already. But this is a very realistic way of fighting sin. That this realization that you're not going to demolish it in one fell swoop. That's Christ's job that he will do at the very end. Okay, as he glorifies us in himself. But in the meantime, as we do this and he has these day by day, this actually helps thinking through it this way, actually helps me at least understand so many biblical texts that talk about these things, like this crucifying the flesh with its passions. Or I know in Luke, Jesus and the other gospels as well, but Jesus talks about taking up your cross daily and following after him, right? There's this daily life of cross existence where we we take up our crosses daily, and there's two parts to that. There's the one part that Jesus means by that, where we will suffer potentially in this life, but another way that the biblical writers throughout the New Testament, specifically Paul, talks about that cross element is not just suffering from the outside, but also putting our flesh on that cross, right? Killing the flesh, denying the flesh. This is what this whole book is about, and it's such an important part of taking up our cross daily. All right, back to John Owen. When a man is nailed to the cross, he struggles and toils at first. He cries out with great strength and might, but as his blood and vitality waste away, his efforts become fainter and fewer. His cries become low and hoarse, scarcely audible. In the same way, when a man first sets out to deal with a lust or compulsion, it struggles with great violence to break loose. It cries with all seriousness and impatience to be satisfied and relieved. But when mortification spills its blood and vitality, it moves more seldom and more faintly. It cries out sparingly and is hardly heard in the heart. Sometimes it may have a dying outburst of great vigor and strength, but that is quickly over, especially if it is kept from any meaningful success. The apostle describes this in Romans 6, especially verse 6. Sin, he says, is crucified. It is nailed to the cross. Cross. To what end? That the body of sin might be rendered useless. The power of sin is weakened and abolished little by little so that we will no longer serve sin. Little by little, so that we will no longer serve sin. That is, we do it so that sin may not incline and impel us so effectively as to make us its servants, as it has done in the past. And this is not only with respect to carnal, sensual affections or the desires of worldly things. It is not only with respect to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, but it is also with respect to the flesh of the mind and will and their natural opposition to God. Whatever the troubling disease is, and however it shows itself, either by driving us to evil or keeping us from good, the rule is the same. Unless it is effectively weakened, all our efforts will miss the goal. A man may cut down the bitter fruit from an evil tree until he is exhausted. As long as the root keeps its strength and vigor, cutting down the hanging fruit will not keep the tree from bearing more. This is the foolishness of some men. They apply themselves earnestly and diligently against an outbreak of lust, but by ignoring its underlying cause, they make little or no progress toward mortification. So let's keep this final paragraph in mind this week. This is the foolishness of some men. They apply themselves earnestly and diligently against an outbreak of lust, but by ignoring its underlying cause, they make little or no progress toward mortification. I pray that today we make some um, progress toward mortification by identifying instead of ignoring the underlying causes of our sins. I know for myself, one of the underlying causes that I have thought through before for myself, especially, and it's interesting, sexual sin is obviously one of the biggest ones that I think many men deal with, lust and sexual sin. Um, for myself, recognizing that one of the underlying causes was a desire to escape and not be held uh, into this. I mean, life is hard, and I found myself more tempted by um, sexual things when I struggled with looking at pornography. Um, I found myself struggling with it in connection many times with when life was hard and life was difficult. And when I started to realize that, and I wish I would have found this book. I got to be honest with you. I wish I would have found this book a long time ago and read this because I think this would have been so helpful for me to understand. When I started realizing that, and I started putting that to the cross, instead of trying to get rid of those fruits, the as he said here, the cutting down the hanging fruit, like the low hanging fruit, will not keep the tree from bearing more. until I started realizing what the real problem was. And there was other ways it was showing itself besides just sexual lust. There was all kinds of ways the sin was showing itself. And so the sin of ultimately just not wanting to do hard things. And once I started realizing that and putting that to death on the cross, that is when I started experiencing real victory over the sin itself, that lust itself, the desire to have ease and comfort and no trouble were the idols that were sitting up in my heart. And another way they showed themselves is when I would get a flat tire or my alternator would stop working on my car. I would be angry, so angry, just so frustrated, and mad because I had to deal with something. Um, I found the same sin was at work when my kids were young. I struggled with, and this was about the same time I was eliminating these, starting to realize this, but I realized that same reality. Sometimes I found that I was frustrated with my children and their disobedience, not because of their disobedience, but because how it inflicted upon me. And when I started to realize that it altered my approach to my children, like okay, this is not about how it's affecting me. This has got to be about what they're doing and me being and disciplining them according to what they have done and what they have not done and etc. But not losing my temper. I found that losing of my temper was just another way that was just another fruit of the same issue. Um, well, anyway, I hope that this has been helpful today. We're going to take a look at the next two in the next two parts. The next one, constant fighting and contending against it. I think is going to be a very interesting one. And then the third one here, realizing success over. I'm really interested in reading this one. I don't know what it means yet, but it sounds like something I wouldn't like realizing success over it. What is he talking about? But he hasn't disappointed me yet, so hopefully he'll be very clear with this. Well, anyway, thank you for listening. I encourage you, if there's a way to subscribe to this podcast, that you do so. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask those things. Thank you for listening.